Welcome to WW2 Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. April 1945. The Third Reich is in its death throes. A regime built on a promise of 1,000 years is collapsing after 12. From east and west, Allied armies spearhead into the heart of Germany, a relentless tide of steel and fire grinding down the last vestiges of Nazi resistance. The air, thick with the smoke of ruined cities and the thunder of artillery, carries the scent of imminent victory. Among the elite units driving this final push are two of the most storied divisions in the U.S. Army, the 101st and 82nd Airborne. These are not ordinary soldiers. They are paratroopers, the screaming eagles and the all-Americans, forged in the crucible of the war's most brutal campaigns. Their legends were written in the night skies over Normandy, along the desperate causeways of Operation Market Garden, and in the frozen foxholes surrounding Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. They are the embodiment of offensive warfare, trained to drop behind enemy lines, to seize the initiative, to fight outnumbered and win. But as the front lines dissolve into a chaotic patchwork of surrender and fanatical last stands, their mission has changed. The skies are now clear of mass parachute drops. These airborne warriors are now fighting as elite infantry, their Moen Garans and Thompson submachine guns clearing towns and villages one by one. For them, the war seems to be winding down into a grueling but straightforward process of occupation. They are advancing through a surreal landscape, a country both beautiful in the Bavarian spring and scarred by the totality of modern war. Yet persistent rumors follow them, dark whispers of strange camps hidden deep in the forests, places spoken of in hushed, fearful tones by the civilians they encounter. These hardened veterans, who believed they had seen the absolute worst of human conflict, were utterly unprepared for the true nature of the enemy they had been fighting for years. They were marching towards an encounter that would not be measured in ground taken or enemies killed, but in the staggering weight of a moral reckoning. They were about to step out of the familiar hell of the battlefield and into the calculated, industrial abyss of the Holocaust. As the final weeks of April bleed into May, the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd have become accustomed to the strange dichotomy of a dying war. One moment they face a suicidal pocket of SS resistance, a desperate flurry of machine gun fire from a Bavarian farmhouse. The next, they are met with white flags and the cautious, weary faces of German civilians. The nature of their advance has transformed. The 101st, pushing deep into southern Germany, moves through the picturesque landscapes of Bavaria, the snow-capped Alps looming on the horizon. The 82nd, operating further north near the Elbe River, navigates the flat, forested plains of Mecklenburg. For both divisions, the primary task is securing territory, rounding up prisoners, and establishing order in the chaos left by the Reich's collapse. The tension of combat is being replaced by the fatigue of occupation. Yet the atmosphere is heavy with an unspoken dread. The fabric of German society has torn, and through the rips, glimpses of something monstrous are beginning to show. Allied intelligence had reports of concentration and labor camps, but their true scale and purpose were vastly underestimated, often dismissed as propaganda. For the common soldier on the ground, these were abstract concepts. Their war was tangible. It was the enemy soldier in the opposite trench, the incoming artillery shell, the Stuka in the sky. It was not a philosophical evil, but a physical threat to be neutralized. As they move deeper, they encounter columns of emaciated, ghost-like people stumbling along the roads, clad in striped rags. These are the survivors of death marches, human wreckage force-marched away from the advancing Allied armies by their SS guards. The paratroopers, well-fed and equipped with the best technology of the American war machine, can only stare in disbelief. They offer sea rations and cigarettes, small gestures of humanity in a landscape stripped of it. But these encounters are fleeting, chaotic previews of a much larger, static horror that lies just ahead, hidden behind barbed wire and watchtowers. The troopers are warriors, not investigators or humanitarian aid workers. Their training manuals contained nothing that could prepare them for this. Every instinct they possessed was honed for combat, for the clear morality of fighting a uniformed enemy. Soon that clarity would vanish, replaced by a profound and disturbing new mission: to become witnesses. On April 27, 1945, elements of the 12th Armored Division, pushing through Bavaria near the town of Landsberg am Lech, were the first to breach the perimeter of a place known as Kaufering IV. It was one of 11 subcamps in the Kaufering complex, itself a satellite system of the infamous Dachau concentration camp. What they found was a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The SS, in a final act of murderous nihilism, had attempted to erase their crimes. They had herded remaining prisoners into the barracks, locked the doors, and set the structures ablaze. Hundreds were burned alive. Others were shot trying to escape the inferno. The next day, April 28th, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division arrived on the scene. The battle-hardened Screaming Eagles, veterans of Hardened and Bastogne, were called in to secure the area and assist the overwhelmed armored troops. The moment they entered the camp's vicinity, their senses were assaulted. A thick, greasy smoke still hung in the air, a sickening combination of charred wood and human flesh that clung to the back of the throat. The ground was littered with bodies in every conceivable state of mutilation, charred, shot, or simply starved to death. Inside the perimeter fence, they found over 500 corpses. The barracks that remained standing were little more than cesspools of disease and despair, packed with the living dead. The few survivors who could still move stumbled towards the Americans, their eyes hollow, their bodies skeletal frames draped in skin and rags. They were the spectral inhabitants of a world beyond comprehension. These paratroopers had faced death daily. They had seen comrades fall beside them, but this was different. This was not the chaotic consequence of battle. It was the methodical, industrial-scale product of pure hatred. There was no military objective here, no strategic value. It was a factory of human suffering. The summary of the camp's records would later reveal the chilling statistics. Kaufering IV held over 36,000 prisoners, the vast majority of them Jewish, forced into slave labor for the German war effort. As the 101st Troopers fanned out through the smoldering ruins, the enormity of what they had found began to sink in. They were standing on cursed ground, the very epicenter of the Nazi ideology they had crossed an ocean to destroy. The descent into the hell of Kaufering IV was a profound shock to the psyche of every 101st Airborne soldier who set foot inside its wire. These were men who prided themselves on their toughness, their ability to endure hardship and witness violence without flinching. But the reality of the camp shattered their hardened exteriors. Medics who had treated grievous combat wounds in the field were now faced with medical conditions they could barely diagnose, let alone treat. Severe malnutrition, typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery were rampant. The living were barely distinguishable from the dead. One veteran later recalled the silence of the survivors, an eerie quiet from people too weak to speak, their eyes simply following the soldiers' movements. The paratroopers walked through the barracks, which were nothing more than partially submerged huts, crude dugouts covered with soil. The stench of excrement, disease, and death was overpowering. Inside, human beings were crammed onto crude wooden shelves, lying in their own filth, many too sick to move. The soldiers, healthy and strong in their combat gear, were giants in a land of pygmies, a stark, uncomfortable contrast that highlighted the grotesque nature of the prisoners' suffering. The task at hand was overwhelming. They had to separate the living from the dead, a gruesome process made difficult by the fact that many of the living were unresponsive. They had to provide food, but quickly learned that giving a standard K ration to a starving person could kill them, a phenomenon known as refeeding syndrome. They had to set up makeshift aid stations, trying to bring a semblance of order and care to a place where humanity had been systematically extinguished. For many troopers, the most haunting discovery was the evidence of the SS's cruelty right up to the final moments. They saw the burned barracks where men, women, and children had been incinerated. They found the bodies of those shot down as they tried to flee the flames. This calculated, last-minute slaughter revealed an evil more profound than any firefight or artillery barrage. It was personal, intimate, and driven by an ideology that viewed these people as less than human. The soldiers of the 101st, who had jumped into Normandy to liberate a continent, now found themselves liberating individuals from the deepest pit of human depravity. The war, for them, gained a new, terrible clarity. It was no longer just about defeating an army. It was about confronting a monstrous crime against humanity itself. Just days later, on May 2, 1945, hundreds of kilometers to the north, another legendary airborne division would have its own horrifying encounter with the Nazi camp system. The 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, were advancing near the town of Ludwigslust in northern Germany, alongside the 8th Infantry Division. Reports came in of a nearby camp, Wöbbelin, initially established as a camp for American and British prisoners of war. It had recently been repurposed. In the last chaotic weeks of the war, Wöbbelin became a dumping ground for thousands of inmates evacuated from other concentration camps further east, ahead of the Soviet advance. When the first American patrols from the 82nd arrived, they found a camp that had completely collapsed under the weight of disease and starvation. The SS guards had fled just hours before, abandoning the approximately 5,000 inmates to their fate. There were no burning barracks here, no evidence of a last-minute massacre. Instead, the All-Americans walked into a scene of passive, silent death. The horror of Wöbbelin was starvation on an unimaginable scale. About 1,000 prisoners were already dead, their bodies lying where they had fallen, in the squalid barracks, in the muddy pathways, piled up in corners. The living were described by the liberators as walking skeletons, figures so emaciated they seemed translucent. The desperation had reached such an extreme that there was evidence of the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. In the face of absolute starvation, some prisoners had resorted to consuming the flesh of the dead to survive. For the paratroopers of the 82nd, this was a vision of an inverted world. These soldiers, whose physical fitness was a point of pride and a necessity for survival, were now surrounded by thousands of human beings who had been deliberately and systematically starved to the brink of extinction and beyond. The camp had been without food or water for several days before liberation. The SS had simply locked the gates and walked away, leaving the inmates to perish. Major General James M. Gavin, the famously tough and youthful commander of the 82nd, was among those who entered the camp. The sights, he would later write, were shocking and appalling. The experience would sear itself into his memory and compel him to take immediate and decisive action, not just to aid the survivors but to ensure the world, and the local German population, would see what had been done. The conditions inside Wöbbelin were a study in human degradation. The paratroopers who entered the gates were hit by a wall of stench, the smell of death and disease so thick it was almost physical. Unlike Kaufering, where the horror was marked by fire and violence, Wöbbelin's tragedy was one of neglect and slow, agonizing decay. The barracks were wooden sheds, overflowing with sick and dying people. There were no latrines to speak of. The entire camp was a quagmire of mud and human waste. Typhus was rampant, and the soldiers had to take precautions against being infected themselves. A reconnaissance patrol from the 82nd reported their findings back to headquarters with a chillingly simple message. It was just a plot of ground with a barbed wire fence around it, inside of which were 5,000 walking skeletons. The report galvanized the division's leadership. General Gavin immediately ordered his men to provide medical aid and food. Army medics and supply trucks were rushed to the scene. They set up kitchens and started preparing soup and other easily digestible foods, having learned the hard lessons about the dangers of feeding the severely malnourished. But even with their intervention, hundreds more would die in the days following liberation. They were simply too far gone, their bodies too ravaged by starvation and illness to recover. The paratroopers, tough men used to the brutal logic of war, found themselves performing tasks they could never have imagined. They gently carried skeletal survivors from the filthy barracks, trying to provide comfort and dignity. They went through the camp, Identifying the Dead, a grim accounting of the Nazi regime's final days. The scale of the death toll was staggering. In the 10 weeks that Wöbbelin had served as a concentration camp, more than 1,000 of its inmates had perished. The evidence of this was everywhere, in the form of unburied corpses that lay scattered across the camp grounds. For the men of the 82nd Airborne, this was a defining moment. They had fought their way across Europe, from Sicily to the Rhine. They had faced some of the best soldiers the German army could field. But this was an enemy they couldn't shoot. It was an ideology, a system of calculated cruelty that had produced this nightmare. The liberation of Wöbbelin was not a battle, but an exorcism of a place where all morality had been murdered. In the face of such profound evil, American commanders on the ground made a crucial and historic decision. It was not enough to liberate the camps and tend to the survivors. The world, and specifically the German people living just miles away, had to see what had been done in their name. This was a policy championed at the highest levels by Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton, and executed with grim determination by division commanders like James Gavin. At Wöbbelin, General Gavin was incensed by the discovery of the camp. He ordered the mayor of the nearby town of Ludwigslust and his officials to tour the camp. He wanted them to witness the piles of bodies and the emaciated state of the survivors. The initial reaction from the German officials was often one of feigned ignorance or disbelief, a response that the American officers refused to accept. Gavin's orders were blunt. He declared that the German civilians of Ludwigslust would give the victims a proper burial. He requisitioned the town square for a funeral service and ordered that the victims be buried in individual graves, not a mass pit, with white crosses to mark each one. He then commanded that the town's population, from the leading citizens down to the ordinary shopkeepers, were to be marched past the bodies to pay their respects. It was a powerful, confrontational act designed to shatter any pretense of denial. A similar scene unfolded in the vicinity of the Kaufering camps. U.S. Army commanders forced the citizens of nearby Landsberg to walk through the camp and witness the horror firsthand. They were then made to dig graves and bury the hundreds of victims with their own hands. The psychological impact of these events was immense, both on the Germans and the American soldiers overseeing them. The paratroopers, acting as guards, watched the faces of the German civilians as they confronted the undeniable truth. Some wept, some were visibly sick, others stared with blank, unreadable expressions. For the soldiers, it was a moment of stark moral clarity. They were not just conquerors, they were enforcers of a terrible, necessary truth. This policy of forced confrontation became a hallmark of the liberation of the camps across Germany. It was a deliberate effort to cauterize the wound of Nazism, to ensure that the phrase, "we didn't know," could never be uttered with any credibility by those who lived in the shadow of the watchtowers. As the initial shock of discovery gave way to the enormous tasks of humanitarian aid and burial, another critical mission began: documentation. Allied command understood from the moment the first camps were found that this was a crime so vast, it might one day be denied. The truth had to be preserved, captured in irrefutable detail for posterity and for the war crimes trials that were sure to follow. This task fell to the men of the U.S. Army Signal Corps and the accredited war correspondents and photographers who traveled with the armies. At Kaufering, Wöbbelin, and dozens of other camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, these men went to work with their cameras and notepads. They systematically documented everything they saw with a cold, professional eye, even as they were personally horrified. They filmed the piles of skeletal corpses being loaded onto trucks and wagons. They photographed the emaciated faces of the survivors, their eyes burning with a mixture of hope and trauma. They captured images of the instruments of death, the crematoria ovens, the gas chambers, the gallows, the barbed wire fences. Every detail was recorded, creating a visual archive of inhumanity that would shock the conscience of the world. The paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd played a crucial role in this process. They secured the sites, ensuring that no evidence could be destroyed. They guided the camera crews, pointing out the worst of the atrocities they had found. They gave testimony, their own words becoming part of the official record. Soldiers who just weeks before had been focused on tactics and combat were now providing eyewitness accounts for the historical ledger. General Eisenhower himself set the tone. After visiting the Oadruff camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald, he was so shaken that he made a point of bringing other high-ranking American and British officials, as well as journalists, to see it for themselves. He stated that he wanted to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda. The footage and photographs taken in April and May of 1945 would become the most damning evidence presented at the Nuremberg trials. These iconic images, captured under the protection of American soldiers, ensured that the Holocaust could not be erased or forgotten. The airborne troops who stumbled upon these camps became more than liberators. They became the guardians of memory. For the thousands of prisoners at Kaufering and Wöbbelin, the arrival of American paratroopers was the moment their long nightmare ended. But liberation was not a single, joyous event. It was the beginning of a new, arduous struggle. The human cost of the camps was measured not only in the dead, but in the profoundly damaged lives of the survivors. The immediate aftermath of liberation was a medical and logistical crisis. The first challenge was simply keeping them alive. Allied medical personnel, including those attached to the Airborne Divisions, worked around the clock in chaotic conditions. They battled typhus epidemics, treated gruesome injuries, and tried desperately to nurse skeletal bodies back from the brink of death. Despite their best efforts, hundreds died in the days and weeks after being freed. Their bodies had endured too much. The psychological trauma was even more immense and lasting. Liberation itself could be a disorienting and even dehumanizing experience. After years of existing in a state of constant terror and deprivation, where every day was a fight for a crust of bread, the sudden presence of well-fed, armed soldiers and the relative chaos of the liberation process was overwhelming. Some survivors were too weak or too deeply traumatized to feel joy, only a numb emptiness. They had lost everything: their families, their homes, their health, and their faith in humanity. The soldiers, in turn, were ill-equipped to handle the psychological needs of the survivors. They were fighting men, not therapists. They could offer food, medicine, and security, but they could not heal the wounds of the soul. The experience created a strange and difficult gulf between liberator and liberated. The soldiers were confronted with a level of suffering they could not truly comprehend, and the survivors were faced with healthy young men from a world they no longer recognized. Rebuilding a life from the ashes of the Holocaust would be the work of decades. For many, the journey would lead to displaced persons camps, and then to new homes in America, Israel, and other parts of the world. But the memory of the camps, the hunger, the fear, the loss, would remain forever. The paratroopers who opened the gates of these hells were the first witnesses to this enduring human cost, a burden they, too, would carry for the rest of their lives. The discovery of the concentration camps left an indelible mark on the elite airborne divisions of the U.S. Army. The men of the 101st and 82nd had been defined by their battlefield exploits, their daring parachute assaults, and their tenacity in defense. Their legacy was one of martial prowess. But in the final days of the war, a new and more somber chapter was added to their history. The experience of liberating Kaufering and Wöbbelin transformed these soldiers. They had gone to war to defeat a military enemy, but they came home as witnesses to a crime against the human spirit. For many veterans, the memories of the camps were more haunting than any battle they had fought. The sights and smells were seared into their minds, images that would resurface in nightmares for decades to come. Many found it difficult, if not impossible, to speak of what they had seen. It was a private horror they carried in a world eager to move on and rebuild. This unexpected encounter with genocide gave a new, profound meaning to their sacrifice. It retroactively justified the entire war effort in a way that no military victory could. They now understood, in the most visceral way imaginable, the true nature of the ideology they had fought. This was not a war for territory or politics. It was a war against a system that built factories to murder people. The testimony of these liberators became a crucial part of the post-war narrative. When they returned home, their stories, along with the photographic evidence they helped secure, educated a world that was still largely unaware of the full scope of the Holocaust. Their words carried the weight of authority. No one could doubt the testimony of a screaming eagle or an all-American paratrooper. Their legacy, therefore, is twofold. They will forever be remembered as the heroes of Normandy, Market Garden, and Bastogne, the tip of the spear that broke the Nazi war machine. But they must also be remembered as the unwilling witnesses, the men who threw open the gates of hell and forced the world to look inside. In doing so, they took on a sacred duty, to bear witness for the voiceless, and to ensure that what they saw would never be forgotten. It was a final, terrible mission, and one that defined their service as much as any jump from a C-47. Thank you for joining WW2 Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.